Hello, and today we'll talk about the Roman Empire. Last time we were talking about the Roman Republic, and we saw how everything came to a terrible end with the assassination of Caesar. Recall the reason for that was that Caesar had allowed himself, or forced himself actually, upon the Roman senators who named him the dictator for life. Several years later, of course, he was assassinated for proclaiming himself or for allowing himself to be called that. Caesar was a dictator. Not only that, but he had tampered with the Senate itself, tried to reduce its powers, in fact had eliminated its powers really by becoming dictator, and had also added some 300 members to the Senate who were loyal to him. So it was precisely because of these reasons that he was assassinated. What followed was chaos for a time. There were several contenders for the throne, if you will. One of them was Octavian, who actually was the adopted son of Caesar. Caesar was also his great uncle, maternal great uncle. So there was a relationship. Caesar's will specified that Octavian would be his successor, but there were others who contested for that honor. One of them was Mark Antony of Cleopatra fame. There would be turmoil. There would be more or less a civil war for some time. But by 31 BC, Octavian becomes the head of the state, more or less, because he's eliminated his competition, and he's the last one standing. He doesn't immediately want to become a dictator or a monarch because he had already seen what happened to Caesar. So what he wants to do is he wants to preserve the institutions of the Republic, but at the same time he wants to try and reserve more and more power for himself without proclaiming himself dictator. He manages to do that quite well. He takes a lot of titles. He becomes first citizen, the princeps. He becomes the head of religion, or the church, so to speak, in Rome. He simply accepts a lot of offices without really wanting to say that his successors would be his son. What he does, however, is in the year 27 BC, he accepts the title, or he takes the title of Augustus, and he becomes known as Augustus, Caesar Augustus. It is a semi-religious title, but essentially it means that he's effectively the emperor of Rome, and he will have that title. And this really begins the Roman Empire from that point on. So when he becomes Augustus, that's the end of the Republic. The question is, what does he do? How does he restore stability? How does he make the empire work so that Rome does not descend into the chaos that it had before? Well, he's got to do a number of things in order to do that. One of them, he's got to reform the army, restructure the army so that the generals are not in charge of it, so that the soldiers are not loyal to them. And this he does. He reorganizes the army. He takes over the entire organization, provisioning of the army. The generals will be named by him. They will be loyal to him because they are answerable to him. The state takes over the funding of the army, requisitioning of the army, putting on the uniforms, literally everything. And not only that, if you have a career in the army, he makes it possible now for you to retire onto land. So he's going to give soldiers who retire land grants so that there's a good reason to actually join the military. And the Roman army now will become really the potent force that it had been before, only now its loyalty is going to be directly to the emperor and to the state. He also organizes something else, however, the Praetorian Guard, which is an army which is kept only in Italy, and is essentially an army to protect him and to protect the state. So there's two different armies. One is to remain entirely loyal to him. That is the one that's kept close to home around Rome. And the army, the imperial army, is kept out in the provinces, closer maybe to the borders, but the whole idea is to maintain order through that army internally. One thing that Augustus does is he makes sure that the generals and the soldiers do not serve in regions where they were born, where they're from, where people would know them, and where they might be able to successfully launch some sort of a civil war. So that's the army reform, and those are very significant reforms, obviously, to maintain stability. He also does something that should have been done much earlier, and that is he organizes something like a civil service, and that is to say that offices now are going to be based on talent, on ability, Again, the civil service will be a loyal bureaucracy, organized from the top down, and it will take over significant functions that had not been done before. And one of those is going to be taxes. The way that Rome had done taxes before was essentially to lease them out to tax collectors. It was like a business, really, nothing like we know today. And these were called tax farmers. They would get to keep a percentage of whatever it is they collected. Not very rational system at all. This will be reversed, this will be changed, and now the professional bureaucracy, professional civil service will take over that function. So you have more regular taxes coming in. You have a much better fiscal base for the empire, and it means that that the state will be run by professionals, unlike perhaps what it was before. A number of other things are done. For example, the organization of public welfare, something that had not been attended to very early on, because the Senate had really been opposed. If you remember the Gracchi brothers and the attempt to at land reform, the attempt to kind of bring grain to the cities in order to feed the poor and the unemployed and so on and so forth. Basically what's going to happen is that Augustus will reorganize the economy. He organizes guilds, for example, so that production will be on a much more regular basis. Everything can be regulated by the state. Guilds, if you're not familiar with them, some people think of them as early unions. They're not really unions, but they're workshops presided over by masters, and they have journeymen who have learned the craft, who work in the workshop, and apprentices who will, of course, be learning the craft from a fairly early age. The whole idea is to sort of regularize the economy, to make it more systematic, to make it fair, to give some protection to people who are working, that kind of thing. So the economy is really reorganized to the extent that it can be. When you take all of these reforms together, you really have the basis, at least, of what was called the Pax Romana, and that is something that's going to last from approximately the time of Augustus, the beginning of Augustus' reign, all the way to about 180. Several other things that Augustus does. For example, I said public works. He rebuilds temples and he builds or rebuilds roads. One of them, the Appian Highway, which is still around today, although it's not used, but it's apparently still in even decent shape so many years later. He oversees construction and sort of reconstruction of buildings. Aqueducts are built so that water can be brought into the cities from the mountains. And so Rome really it reminds me quite a bit of the United States in a lot of ways. It becomes a very modern place. It has a currency which becomes very stable, and it's a currency that is used throughout the realm, throughout the empire. So it's very, very, this is the base of the Pax Romana, and it's going to work pretty well, as I said. One other thing that comes as a result of the work of Augustus, and that is that he doesn't establish a monarchy, as I said, so what the successor is going to be essentially the adopted son, and that's going to be an institution which prevails all the way to Marcus Aurelius in 180 or so. And what this is, it means that your own son will not inherit the throne, so to speak. So it does establish a kind of succession, nevertheless, and it works pretty well. At least it works pretty well during the period of the Pax Romana. This period, as I said, is a period of relative peace. That doesn't mean that there aren't assassinations of the emperors. You do have some skirmishes, some brief kind of civil wars. But at the same time, with the establishment of a much more stable army, with the establishment of the civil service, with the guilds that relatively work relatively well, Rome really does have a period of peace. And in fact, or I should say relative peace. And in fact, the empire works quite well all the way up to the period of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius also was a philosopher, a Stoic, but he was the emperor. Now, when he does become emperor, he departs from what had been the practice previously. He names his son his successor. So he's really establishing a monarchy. And that is really going to disturb the army again. It's going to disturb many people because he's reestablishing the kind of thing that people still can remember was happening under Julius Caesar and even some others. So this period marks more or less the beginning, after 180, really marks the beginning of the end of the Pax Romana. The Roman Empire goes on, however, but there's going to be a lot of problems after 180. For one thing, just the fact that Marcus Aurelius has departed and named his son to succeed him disturbs the army quite a bit. And it's going to lead to a little bit of turmoil within the army. The other thing, though, is that the empire had expanded quite a bit. Actually, it expanded even under the Augustus, and it had reached all the way from Gaul, which is modern-day France, all the way to what it was essentially Romania, way into Eastern Europe. It was huge. Maintaining an army in order to defend the borders of this kind of empire was bound sooner or later to be a monumental task and maybe to drain the resources of Rome. And that's precisely what's going to happen, so that by the time you get to 180, it's become more and more difficult to simply sustain the army, and also the army now, by the time you get to 180, 200, has an additional problem, and that is that there's a number of German troops, German armies, German tribes, which are beginning to make incursions into Europe. So the borders have to be defended precisely at a time when it seems that Rome is going through some political turmoil, and its economy also begins to slip. So let me talk about the economy just briefly. Although despite all the reforms that Augustus made, the economy never really develops in the way that it should have, and there's several reasons for that. For one thing, we're talking about a period when there was very little incentive to invest in technology. Do you ever wonder why? Well, why didn't the Romans develop an automobile or things like that? They didn't have an incentive to do that. One of the reasons was that although Rome did grant citizenship to many, many did not get citizenship. And one of the things that had always been around was slavery. And when you have slaves, and a significant number of people were slaves, what you have is no need to develop technology because you simply have an abundance of labor power or slaves that you can use. That was a problem. Another problem was this, and that was that there was an unemployment problem. It was never really solved. Remember in the 1st century BC that there was a significant unemployment problem, and nobody knew how to solve that. There was a surplus population ended up in Rome. Began to have that again after 180, when the empire simply has more and more problems sustaining itself, maintaining an army. And the result is that the army itself is going to go through a period of turmoil. You're going to have more disturbances in the provinces. The army, which is no longer funded by the state the way that it had been, begins to kind of go off in its own direction and turns to brigandage quite often, confiscation of resources, at the same time that the army is desperately needed in order to defend the borders. So unemployment problems which began to prevail, the problem of an army which is once again going into turmoil. Generals, when they're no longer sustained by the state the way they had been, become more independent. All of these problems begin to build for Rome in the period after 180. The response is to basically force labor, that is to say, to force people to work for very little, and essentially to enslave them practically. And the same thing is going to happen with regard to the peasants. One of the things that Rome was doing at this point was to keep the price of grain as low as possible so that the surplus populations could be fed. And I'm talking now about more and more unemployed people. When you begin to do that, when you begin to confiscate more and more grain, force more and more labor, keep prices down on grain, what you do is eventually you ruin farming and you ruin farmers, and they become also part of the surplus population. When you add all these things together, Rome is in a terrible position by the time you get to roughly 285, when Diocletian becomes the emperor, and he'll be the emperor 285 to 305. What's happening now is the economy is quite literally falling apart. And not only that, but Rome begins to devalue the currency even before 285. And when that happens, that means that the coin of the realm is worth less. That's what devaluation means, or debasing the coinage. And what happens when you make money itself worth less is inflation. So inflation is happening. The cost of maintaining an army, which by the way has already swelled to about 500,000 men. That's an enormous size for an army in this period of time. Remember that Alexander's army, Alexander the Great's army, was only 35,000 men. Now we're talking about 500,000 men. Diocletian doesn't know how to respond to that. One thing he does, well, the West is not doing so well, but the East is still doing pretty well, so he moves to the East. He moves to approximately what's now Turkey, around what's now Istanbul, what would be Constantinople. So he moves really the capital there, and while there, he more or less presides over the Roman Empire, but this is acknowledging that the West is really going down. And in fact, the West is now going through a period of depopulation, currency destabilization, massive discontent because of lack of employment, and so on and so on. And all the time, there was never any incentive, as I said, to develop the economy by investing in technology. So it all comes to a sort of a crashing in with Diocletian. What does he do? He does exactly what he shouldn't do. He basically makes the peasantry, the free peasantry, so-called, into slaves again. He makes them serfs, and he basically continues what was really a wrong policy. He makes it impossible for workers to leave jobs even if they're not making any money or very little money. And he basically freezes their wages, which means that, well, if you're making very little and you can't really sustain yourself anymore, basically you're going to just leave the job and flee somewhere. And what he has done, his policies simply lead to even more turmoil. So in the end, this is exactly the wrong thing to do. When you compound all these problems by the fact that by the 4th century and then the 5th century, you begin to get incursions of the German tribes into Rome, then you might say, well, this is more or less the end, because the army by now cannot be sustained. Many of the troops in the army actually are Germans themselves who had come into the army. And in any case, in 410 AD, and the German tribes, several German tribes, actually make it all the way into Rome, and they burn the city down. The empire goes on, of course, and much of its legacy will actually endure. Nevertheless, the empire, particularly in the western part of the empire, at this point, is more or less dead. There will be some significant developments later, but the empire itself is dead. Nevertheless, a great legacy. One of the things I haven't talked about very much is the Roman law. That will actually continue. That was an enormous advance. Just the fact that you can put this huge empire on the basis of a universal laws, and that these will be defended above all, and that you should have republican institutions which are based on law. This itself was an enormous accomplishment, plus all the practical gains that Rome did make, such as the aqueducts and the roads, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's it. So next time we'll talk about the rise of Christianity.